Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ESMAP's first Hydrogen for Development Partnership webinar for 2026. Today we have two amazing speakers that are not only part of the H4D initiative, but are also supporting the efforts that we are doing on industrial decarbonization. So today we have Herman Jonker from the Western Cape government and Degar Sagin from the OECD in order to discuss South Africa's path to industrial decarbonization. And today we will be focusing on one of the country's most strategic sectors, which are iron and steel. And before we start the session, we want to share with you that the H4D webinars are monthly sessions that we organize in order to share the knowledge from the partners that are part of H4D. Right now, we are 55 partners, and this initiative is already in its third year of activities. The heavy industry and industrial decarbonization is no longer a long-term aspiration. It's a near-term competitiveness and development imperative. And South Africa sits at a critical intersection of industrial capacity, energy transition, and global net zero commitments. Today, during this 60-minute session, we will be hearing the opinion and the views and the most relevant report that has been published by the OECD. And we encourage the participants to submit their questions in the chat so we can address them later. Without further ado, please, I would like to welcome Dolph Gillen, who is a hydrogen lead and senior energy economist at the World Bank, for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carolina, and many thanks to the speakers and to the participants today. So the topic is decarbonization of the steel industry in South Africa. For us, as Carolina alluded to, I mean, it's part of the Hydrogen for Development Partnership webinar series, because hydrogen is a key part of the solution. And also in the context of our 10 gigawatt lighthouse initiative, where we work with other financing institutions to see how we can get the first projects to FID. This is very relevant because South Africa is one of the 10 countries, 10 priority countries we have selected to see how we can together strengthen the financing for these first hydrogen and hydrogen derivative projects. The steel industry globally is of particular relevance because it's somewhere between 7 and 12% of global energy and process CO2 emissions, so a very substantial share. The output of that industry is massive, more than 2 million tons of steel and about 1,500 megatons of primary steel. If you would make all of that with hydrogen, you would need a volume of hydrogen roughly equivalent to today's world production of hydrogen. So it's a potentially very significant market also. And in the context of South Africa, of course, we are closely engaged in energy transition in South Africa. Of course, the electricity supply issues is an important issue. Transmission is an important issue, but there's also substantial industry in South Africa. And iron and steel is an interesting case because there is a number of iron mines in South Africa, especially Northern Cape. And there is an opportunity to create jobs and economic activity through the upgrading of that ore instead of just exporting it. And to give you an example, we were a few months ago in Namibia, and in Namibia, the first hydrogen hydrogen iron plant has opened, and that plant imports iron ore from South Africa and then exports the iron back to South Africa. So that's already an excellent example of regional cooperation. But of course, it also points to the fact that there may be opportunities in South Africa itself to do some of that upgrading. So that's and a final point is we are working with the government of South Africa at the moment to develop an industrial decarbonization program as part of the CIF funding for the industrial decarbonization program. So South Africa was one of 7 countries selected, is currently developing a program on this topic. So there will be some funding available. So that's my introductory remarks, and I hand back to Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolph, for your opening remarks. From the global perspective, we now turn to the national and subnational implementation lens. It is a pleasure to welcome Herman Jonker, Senior Manager for Industrial Coordination at the Western Cape Government. Herman has played a central role in industrial infrastructure development, including Freeport Saldanha, and currently leads coordination of the Western Cape Green Hydrogen Strategy and Roadmap. He will share practical insights on how South Africa and the Western Cape, in particular, is approaching industrial decarbonization, infrastructure readiness, and project enablement. Herman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for the introduction. Good afternoon on my side, but I guess good morning on the other side of the globe for everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this webinar. I would like to just put a little bit of a proviso I normally do at the front of this type of presentation, that I'm not an engineer and not technically trained. So very often when it gets into the molecules and the electrons, I quickly run out of bandwidth. I'm trained in economics, and my experience has very much been as an economic practitioner over the last few years. Maybe I could just set the context of my organization before I jump into my presentation. I work for a government, subnational government, the Western Cape government. We are a province in South Africa. We don't quite have the same mandate as state governments in federal structures. So many of the mandates of government sit at a national level, and at a provincial level, we're relatively small in terms of capacity and mandate. Main mandates sitting at provincial government are education and health. So we have quite big departments that run a lot of hospitals and schools. But as far as an economic development department, we are not policy leads for the country. We take all of our policy guidance and mandate from the national economic policy and implement at a subnational level. That said, we try to punch a little bit above our weight, and maybe it comes through in the presentation. I would like to take a bit of a conversational approach to the presentation and just share our experience over the last 5 years. Even as an economic practitioner, I have a portfolio that spans a number of elements around industrialization and helping private sector make certain investments in our economy where we see the structure of the economy going. And hydrogen is a portion of my portfolio, green hydrogen. So I've landed this task of coordinating the Western Cape's green hydrogen efforts. And that's where, you know, I really need to try and punch above my weight. It is a much bigger task than what we've got resources for at this stage, but hopefully we'll grow it very soon, and you'll see it from the way that I explain our experience. And I think this is not unique. This is something that maybe many of you have experienced. And so I'd be very happy to take any discussion points. The presentation is a little bit of a flyover, with a fair amount of detail under each of the sections. And so if anybody is keen to dive into any of the detail, I'm happy to do so. I've just pressed share on my side on the presentation, but I would just like to receive an indication of whether it's visible to everyone.
We can see it, Herman. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, I'm just going to explain a little bit of our last 5 years worth of experience. And like the picture on the right-hand side, we've had our ups and our downs, our peaks and our valleys. As you can see by the few discussion points that I'm setting out, some early efforts, some momentum going up and down, and hopefully now accelerating to something quite exciting. So when I first joined some of the hydrogen work in our country, we have a pretty long history as a country in hydrogen. We have one of the single biggest producers of hydrogen in Sasol, our big chemical company, but obviously that's grey hydrogen. And so in the hydrogen space, we've been focusing on chemical use, except also a little bit of the fuel cell developments in the last 20 years has been a focus of our Department of Science and Technology. And as you can see in the picture on the right-hand side, we have these centers of excellence called under a project called Hydrogen SA that have been running for quite a while. And in 2021, we launched the Hydrogen Society Roadmap, which was the country's hydrogen strategy focused on a certain valley called the Hydrogen Valley because of the area that it covered between some of the mining areas and some of the industrial areas in the country. And that quickly led us into getting into the green hydrogen conversation, with even quite a big tour of some of our senior officials to the EU, and R1 billion of public money being given to support decarbonization of industry. At a subnational level, ourselves in the Western Cape have a special economic zone called Freeport Saldanha. They did quite an intensive market study because they have been getting market signals about developers wanting to do hydrogen projects in Saldanha. It coincided with the study at the bottom, where the picture shows here around ships fuels, that identified South Africa as a future shipping fuel hub, and Saldanha featured quite specifically in the locational advantages, and that started to really trigger the market. On the right-hand side, in the bottom, you see some of the country's value proposition as it was set out at the time, including great renewable resources and some proprietary technology competency. On the left-hand side, in the bottom, you can see a pilot plant. This is a small project at the time that I think 10 kilowatts only of renewable energy to start with, but they were producing green hydrogen molecules as early as 2021. Very quickly, the market started to signal that they want to put projects in Saldanha, and before we knew it, we had more than 30 projects knocking on the door of Freeport Saldanha. And the activity really took us by surprise. So we try to catch up a little bit. We try to catch the wave that was upon us. As a government, we had a position paper and a mandate to develop a strategy going through our political structures called the cabinet, like a national government, except it's the regional subnational cabinet. On the right-hand side there, you see that our approvals at the end of 2022 was to give us that mandate. We also co-hosted with the presidency at the first Green Hydrogen Summit for the country. We put some of our officials, as you see in the middle there, we put some of our senior officials on the speakers slots on the panels, and that really helped us to get momentum internally as well as externally, especially in our discussions with some of the international funders. At a national level, also there was a new policy document published called the Commercialization Strategy that went out for comment about the same time as our provincial position paper was published. Then in 2023, the momentum really picked up. The Commercialization Strategy of our national department of in fact, the Commercialization Strategy was launched through the Industrial Development Corporation, which is an entity of our Department of Trade, Industry, Competition. At our level, subnational level, we started getting organized into work streams, and we started developing our strategy. Later that year, we also published it for public comment. we started also to participate in some of the international movements like the World Hydrogen Summit, H4D, and even on a private sector level, a lot of projects gained major momentum. And maybe I'll pause here for a second to explain one of the big differences between the way South Africa has approached green hydrogen and the way Namibia has approached it, is that in Namibia there was a very early focus of the whole of government. And at a very high level, a very senior level, national ministerial level, there was immediately a task team to look at this very specific project. One of the big things that enabled that for Namibia was the fact that a big portion of the land holdings where the renewable energy and even the hydrogen production and export facility could be established belonged to the government. So they could go out on a single turnkey solution to the market. Whereas in South Africa, we saw these private sector players coming with proposed projects. None of the land was government owned, or very little, maybe some of the portions near port and the likes of the Freeport Saldanha, which is a special zone, and in one or two other special economic zones in the country. But mostly these were private projects being funded with private money, and the pre-feasibility work progressed very rapidly, but in quite an uncoordinated way. So quite a difference between how it was done in Namibia. They seem to take a quicker route in Namibia early on. It does feel like South Africa is catching up and possibly joining the advanced stage of development. But the makeup was quite different. And I say that because in the makeup where it's a bunch of private sector projects approaching the market, government plays a facilitation role in order to coordinate efforts a little bit more than when there is a defined central government approach and one big project going to the market. So we started to develop some of the common user infrastructure, and these were all in the forms of studies, pre-feasibility studies, mostly a study to put in a pipeline, which you'll see in one of the graphics a little bit later on. Even on water desalination and on other bulk infrastructure, we had great assistance from the World Bank. In the right-hand bottom, you can see the pre-feasibility study that was published at the end of 2023 around zero carbon bunker fuel. That study went into a lot of detail, even on the physical location and layout of this potential project. And we got into a fair amount of the engineering around whether to transmit electrons or transport molecules in order to make the geographies of projects work. And this is mostly because the good renewable resources were slightly dislocated from where the port is. In fact, the further inland you go, the less of the ocean influence you get. So you lose a little bit of wind, but you gain a lot of sunshine. And we've just been in contact with one of our major project developers over the last 2 days, having finalized engineering studies on exactly what the wind and solar capacity looks like, and the numbers are phenomenal. Even if you go as little as 200 kilometers north of the port of Saldanha, you get some of the best solar irradiation and wind capacity factors combined in the world. They reckon they're on the second best geographic location in the world to produce renewable energy, especially for hydrogen, of course, because it's the combination between solar and wind, with a lot of wind at nighttime and incredible irradiation during the daytime. We also started to look at partnerships. There's an interesting partnership called the Three Capes MOU. So 3 of our provinces in the southwestern part of the country are called Capes. The one is the Northern Cape, we sit in the Western Cape, and then there's also an Eastern Cape. So these 3 Capes started to collaborate on some of the regional infrastructure requirements and even linked that into Namibia. The Northern Cape is situated just south of the Namibian border. And in fact, the major Namibian project, the Hyphen project, is much closer to industrial power offtake and hydrogen offtake in South Africa than it is in Namibia. So there's a great combination of what we then call this Southern SADC corridor for developing hydrogen infrastructure up and down the southern tip of Africa on the west coast, where the renewable energy potential is just magnificent. On the project side, we started to look at some of our bilateral arrangements with the private projects. We would host them in fairly structured conversations and follow up on project activities. This started to get very exciting as we saw the beginning of some of the land acquisition by private projects, and a lot of the study work and conceptual work and policy work that government was doing was actually being outpaced by some of the private projects, and I'll get into how that affected us in a second. Then last year before last, there was a little bit of a slowdown, and actually what was interesting was that it felt like globally 2024 was a fast year for hydrogen outside of the country and a slow year for hydrogen inside the country. And I'll get to how that has changed into 2025. On the positive side, we had a very well-defined provincial strategy for the economy and for hydrogen being approved and becoming a lead policy position. At the same time, we had a national election and the National Unity Government was formed, Government of National Unity. And this meant that a lot of the horse trading between different political parties were put aside in order to get a common vision. It put the country on a whole new trajectory in terms of political stability. And as a subnational government, that was in election terms governed by an opposition party, it was sometimes difficult to get traction with some of the national departments where a lot of the mandate sat, as I explained earlier. So for the first time as an opposition-ruled province, we were part of a national government, the Government of National Unity. Even though there's still party political differences, there's a lot of policy coherence, a lot of certainty around how the market is approached and how private sector investment is being not just sourced but also supported. And in fact, it showed in some of our hydrogen work in that the 2022 and 2023 hydrogen summits were hosted by a unit in the national government called Infrastructure South Africa, and they would normally host investment summits. And these hydrogen summits became a flagship of the type of investment summits that the country was hosting. So it was great momentum from a government point of view, and that we also saw that the private sector moved quite rapidly, starting to buy large swathes of land, not just for renewables, which we were pretty good at as a country, but for renewables that would then feed into hydrogen projects. On the negative side, we felt an enormous fiscal crunch, and that came with this Government of National Unity and the principle of tying down the government's fiscal austerity, which over time has been very good for the country. We've seen a lot of a better spending structure out of the government fiscus. We've seen a lot of clampdown on the likes of big corrupt contracts for our state-owned enterprises. We've recently seen our credits ratings improve and South Africa being taken off the grey list for investment. So this was the start of a real positive shift, but with some negative consequences, especially for us. We were waving the flag for a new portion of the economy that we needed quite a bit of funding for, and the focus was on getting schools and hospitals to put kids in classrooms and serve patients in hospital beds. And there was a pretty serious funding lack, which we then bore the brunt of as a relatively small expenditure component in the government business. Luckily, we got our strategy published, and at the bottom left is the picture of the vision for the country. Right on the sort of north-south or vertical line is the depiction of the pipeline going from Namibia down to where we are in Saldanha, and then eventually also linking up with the rest of the country. In the eastern side, there's the enormous industrial center where the energy demand is extremely high, but on the western side is where the renewable energy resources are phenomenal, world-class. So we had a clear picture of where we wanted to go. We're really keen to start implementing, but we were constrained with government capacity and funding allocations. Then in 2025, there was an enormous acceleration. So part of what happened in the government structures was that Infrastructure SA that I mentioned earlier was led by Dr. Ramagopa, who was then appointed as our energy minister. So now all of a sudden the person who was out there trying to convince the world to invest in hydrogen in South Africa has also become the lead policymaker for energy in the country. So no longer was this sort of upward fight against some of the skepticism that existed in the political ranks, and some of that skepticism was fueled by an energy shortage in the country, and obviously then the rhetoric started. But if you can't produce enough energy for our own residents and our own industries, how is it that you now want to promote projects where potentially energy will be exported, albeit in the form of PTX molecules and not in the country's electricity grid, but it was still a developmental focus that was shifting away from hydrogen, which we had to combat. We're very fortunate that this past year, the year that we've just finished with, 2025, also saw some institutional arrangements being solidified. At the bottom here, you see a depiction of the institutional structures that were settled in national government under our Just Energy Transition Program. There's now a green hydrogen portfolio. The picture in the middle, which is not too visible, but is just the structure of how we report all the way into the national government, from work streams at the bottom through some of the Just Energy Transition interministerial committees into our national cabinet. And on the right-hand side is a depiction of how the green hydrogen portfolio is structured. I can't remember. Yes, I did. I included a photograph of the team, highly competent individuals that were put into a project office, and now have a strong mandate, which is clearly defined here in what their strategic role and their core functions are. So this is at a national government level. This is not where we sit at the in the Western Cape government, but we've managed to have an enormous increase in the way that we coordinate between national and provincial government. And a lot of the Western Cape projects, a lot of our Saldanha projects, a lot of our private sector developers have become the flagships for our national hydrogen drive. I'll mention a little bit on some of the practical progress in those projects in a second. Furthermore, this is the page where I show a little bit of our subnational progress and that of the private projects. So on the top right-hand side, you see some graphic depiction of some of the master planning work that we've been doing. And there two things came out of the master planning. One is that geospatially, it's very important to get things right, especially if you want to establish something for the future. So what are your transport corridors? Where do bulk infrastructure, shared infrastructure need to be developed? We're very fortunate in that we have a fully developed port, one of the biggest ports in the Southern Hemisphere, and we have fairly good water, electricity, road, even rail networks that connect this port with the large parts of the country. But we also realized that if we were going to do the likes of pipelines, upgraded electricity grid, etc., that if you get it right for the system, you can really optimize the ecosystem for individual projects, and those individual projects then end up with a much lower cost of levelized cost of hydrogen. For example, water infrastructure, a bulk desalination project is on the go. For grid infrastructure, some of the major grid upgrades are in feasibility mode, and we're even moving to full feasibility on potential pipeline options. So scenarios were created, the volumes were calculated, and we've got a very, very good grip on what we can very realistically expect in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, and out to 2050. However, and this is where the momentum shift has also come in. In our planning for bulk infrastructure and for shared infrastructure, even in our planning for decarbonizing industry as a whole, the private sector has completely outsprinted government, and the specific projects that need approvals, that need infrastructure of a public nature, are just at an urgent phase and no longer at a let's plan properly phase. And so even in our master planning exercise, we have turned the whole master plan on its head, and instead of saying let's solve for 2050 and work our way back, we've started to say let's assume that the current projects on our radar are the ones that will succeed, and let us build and contribute to the infrastructure that these projects require, at the risk, obviously, of getting locked into suboptimal arrangements of where you put a pipeline, where you put a grid line, what kind of port access and size of loading facilities you build, etc. So it may be that we are compromising a little bit on the medium-term efficiency, and especially on the overall long-term ecosystem optimization. But we now know that we need to catch up with where these projects are at, and they are very keen to get to bankability and start constructing infrastructure. I'll make a note on that in a second. One of our very, very fast-moving projects is exactly the directly reduced iron project that ArcelorMittal has. So this is a fully developed steel plant. There's a picture of the plant here. It does about 1.2. It has the capacity to do about 1.2 million tons per annum of thin hot rolled coil. They start with the iron ore that's available right next door from a large export facility, and they end with very high quality, very thin rolled coil. There's even a value add facility of another company next door. So there's a little bit of an industrial complex around steel, but really the steel mill is a relatively modern facility. However, it's currently under care and maintenance and not being used. And ArcelorMittal has now gone to the market to possibly dispose this asset, but not just as a steel mill, but rather as a green DRI project. And they've got very detailed indication of what it entails, how it's configured, and we can dive into some of that if some detail is required. What I can also mention is that one of our leading projects that combine Eastern Cape and Western Cape real estate, called Hive Energy, they have had some funding announcements made at the Africa Hydrogen Summit last year. And they've also just recently got approval for the biggest wind farm project in the country. Up to now, the biggest renewable energy project in the country is in the order of 270 megawatts. And we have 6 to 7 gigawatts worth of renewables already established in the country. They have now full environmental approval for a single wind project of a full gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts worth of wind ready and approved. There are also 2 or 3 other major investors that have renewable energy approvals. We just had a project meeting yesterday with a company that's got 300 megs worth of solar, and they are progressing with a lot of their commercial arrangements. They're starting to pay license fees for OEM manufacturers for solar, wind, and for electrolysis capacity. Okay, so there's a lot more information about a very exciting year that we've had in 2025, where it felt like this time around, the opposite of 2024, that the world has seen a slowdown and we have felt this ramp up. And from an economic practitioner sitting in a policy positions point of view, it's exciting that that your work is coming to fruition, but it's also quite intimidating because we've got these large private sector projects that are putting money, they are really spending a lot of money on getting all their detailed engineering, land ownership, approvals, etc. in place, as well as now concluding deals with financiers and equity partners. And I'll mention that in a second. So our focus for 2026 really is around the coordination side on the way that we're implementing our partnerships. So at a national level and at a subnational level, there's an enormous amount of work stream work going on. And in a work stream is something that we would define where there's a project team, a project scope, and maybe not necessarily specific infrastructure projects like a piece of grid or pipeline, but at least very well-defined policy positions or infrastructure positions that will assist the private sector. So in our master planning as a province, in our master planning, we're moving into an implementation readiness phase, whereas at national, there's also a consolidation of what the infrastructure master plan will look like for hydrogen for the country. So by the end of this year, we should have a national infrastructure master plan for hydrogen. We're getting very, very good direct support from the national team into our projects. So we've bridged the gap from a policy unit at national level a mix of policy and implementation unit at sub-regional level into a full team that is now focused on private sector projects where we can unblock some of the hurdles. So, for example, we hope to see some cabinet resolutions early this year around hydrogen projects and how they're integrated into the national energy picture, both for practical issues like grid connections and a wheeling framework, but also for incentive and policy assistance around, for example, including hydrogen projects into special economic zones, which automatically gives those projects the full suite of special economic zone incentives, including tax incentives and some other support. On the wheeling framework, I can just maybe briefly mention that a lot of our projects at this stage are islanded, so they would have their own infrastructure all the way from collecting solar and wind energy to producing molecules, but quite a few projects have dislocated renewable energy generation sites from production sites. And wheeling the energy across that network has a certain framework in the country, but the cost is quite high because we have a national transmission development company that owns the whole of the transmission network, the whole of the grid. For hydrogen, we are proposing a new framework, which we hope to get through cabinet soon, that brings the cost down significantly for hydrogen projects, because the idea is not just that they're using the network to get energy, but rather they're adding to the generation capacity as well as then the load of taking electrons from the grid. We're having another Green Hydrogen Summit in Cape Town around September this year. We're quite excited about what that's going to bring. And then some of the shared infrastructure projects should also be finalized this year. On a private sector project basis, I could just mention that one or two of the projects that I mentioned earlier will get to financial close as early as June this year. So we have 2 or 3 projects that have the potential to at least come to a final investment decision, but possibly even break ground on some of their construction activities on the renewable side by the 3rd quarter of this year. So there's a lot of excitement. We are feel a little bit like we're staring down a tunnel and there's a light coming towards us rather than just seeing a light opening up. But we're readying ourselves for really seeing the industry taking not just the voluntary leap into decarbonization, but actually the taking the opportunity of establishing a market for producing low carbon energy, for using electrons to turn into molecules, and then even to some local industry decarbonization, which the steel industry is the great example of. And I can't wait to hear from our next speaker what that entails. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Herman, for this excellent presentation, very comprehensive. It is fantastic to hear what is the national and also the provincial perspectives on hydrogen. And also it is great to learn what are the developments on infrastructure. And personally, I believe that listening that 2 to 3 projects can achieve FID is also something great that we look forward to following up. And we are pleased now to welcome Deger Saigin. He's the Industry Program Lead for Clean Energy, Finance and Investment Mobilization at the OECD. His work focuses on policy analysis, system modeling, and international cooperation to support net zero pathways. And today, Deger will present key findings from the OECD analysis of South Africa's iron and steel sector, highlighting decarbonization pathways. Thank you, Deger, for this presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for the H4D team to invite us today to share some insights of the analysis we've carried out in the context of South Africa's steel industry. I think Ignacio will be sharing the slides, and while he's doing that, I just want to add a few things to what Dolph has mentioned at the start of his introductory remarks. Indeed, the starting point, and as the title of the report, the presentation implies, decarbonization. However, when the steel industry focus was selected together with the South African government, and in relation to the steel decarbonization, hydrogen being a core part of that decarbonization effort, the discussion scaled up to social economic aspects, especially given steel industry down also the entire value chain employs more than 200,000 people in the country. Its role for trade and creating partnerships, as the example by Dolph given on the iron ore and derived iron with Namibia. And also in the context of industry decarbonization in South Africa, the competitiveness and economic resilience. So number of dimensions that go beyond just the climate and decarbonization discussion that are essential for the economic growth of the country. Now, with that in mind, the work which we've undertaken actually feeds into a number of national and also international efforts. So this is the typical OECD report with a comprehensive list of policy recommendations. And the South African government has taken this report, especially the DTIC, so that's the Trade Industry Department, to use the outcomes of the report for the steel roadmap that is being currently in preparation. So that's an important impact of this work. Another one is a new project that is starting, funded through the Mitigation Action Facility. There's also a close link with the outcomes of this work and that new project starting, also focusing on steel. And then finally, at the more international level, as Dolph mentioned, the CIF selected 7 countries. One of them is South Africa, and steel industry is critical. And for that reason, the work we've done provides some guidance in which financing instruments, de-risking instruments, could be meaningful and effective for decarbonizing the sector, including through hydrogen. And finally, it hopefully will also provide some support to the 10 gigawatt lighthouse initiative of the World Bank. So a number of things in relation, and I would like to start with the next slide about with very high level key messages from this work. As I mentioned, the sector is vital for South Africa's economy, but the decarbonization for the different dimensions I've described is critical. Its transformation requires 2 basic solutions, and I'll describe what those are in more detail in a minute. One is the improvement of the enabling investment conditions, and the second is providing economic support with different types of mechanisms, instruments for the decarbonization of the steel industry. And with that, South Africa, which is the second largest steel producer in the African continent after Egypt, could become, with a decarbonized, more resilient, more competitive iron and steel sector, a global key player in that regard. If you can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the process. I'll talk a little bit about the results, and then finally I'll spend some minutes on the recommendations. At OECD, we have a framework which we developed 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago, which we call the Framework for Industry's Net Zero Transition. So that's our main tool mechanism to cooperate with are members, but also partner countries, where South Africa is one of them. And it's all a country demand-driven process. The framework implementation in any country, in collaboration with the country, results in number of recommendations and financial solutions that can support the development of a pipeline of projects. And it also can help for specific projects in mind of the country that are being, planned to be developed or already in development phase, about how they can be financed. Or a country can, on the basis of these recommendations, can take let's say, a feasibility study and discuss with a bank of how they can be financed. So it's quite also practical. That's why I said at the beginning it's a more traditional OECD study with recommendations, but its use is very practical. Next slide, please. With the government of South Africa, the engagement began in early 2023 or late 2022, and the government, after internal consultation, requested from the OECD to focus on the steel industry as a critical sector for the reasons I've described. And throughout 2023 and 2025, we have worked on a number of technologies that the government has also selected with consultation with different stakeholders. And we looked into their business cases in terms of costs, in terms of emissions impact, and then developed solutions for about how they can be invested in. The report was released in the context of South Africa's G20 presidency at the margins of the Environment, Climate Sustainability Working Group in October, the day before the ministerial meeting. And as I mentioned locally, it attracted a lot of attention from all different stakeholders. Next slide, please. We do the same type of work with other countries, but in the case of South Africa, and because also of the nature of the sector, we were able to look at, indeed, hydrogen as one solution, but also all types of other low carbon or near zero emission technologies, such as CCUS, biomass electrification, energy efficiency, as options to decarbonize the iron and steel industry. I'll focus more on the hydrogen, but for any reason you're interested, you will find the same results for other technologies as well. Next slide, please. Now, the work has been conducted in a very close cooperation with the government. First of all, a steering committee was established, which was chaired by the DTIC. And the other line ministries that were involved were the Environment Ministry, so the DFFE, and the National Treasury. DSI was also closely engaging in the steering committee to this work. The Steel Industry Association, the Bank Association were also parts of the or members of the steering committee. OECD's role was a secretariat to this committee. I'm explaining that especially to underline the government ownership to this work. And the steering committee basically agreed each step on the results and what the next step of the work would be towards its completion. This committee was complemented by a broader participating stakeholder group called the Technical Advisory Committee, which provided data, which provided feedback, but also supported on the selection of the focus, the technologies, and so on and so forth of the work. And then finally, we had a much bigger extended stakeholder list where also some of you were part of. So the stakeholder engagement was quite strong. Next slide, please. The report structure, which you can find online, I won't take you through it in detail, but as I mentioned, it has a very heavy focus on the economic assessment of the selected near zero emission, low carbon technologies. Then it looks into all different types of policy and financing instruments that could be useful in the context of South Africa for closing the cost gap. And then finally, there are more than 10 recommendations that the government can pick up in making these technologies cost competitive and start their investment and implementation. Next slide, please. Just looking into the situation of the steel industry in South Africa. Compared to about 15, 20 years ago, the production is about 1/3 or half less than what it is today, for reasons of declining demand and also the dynamics in the broader region in terms of production and demand. Yet there is still a production of about 5 million tons per year in South Africa for steel, which is used to coming from a split between electric arc furnaces and basic oxygen furnace. But that also split has been changing over the years. Now, the current capacity is being used about, let's say, 65%. So there's a lot of capacity that is being not fully utilized. And the steel industry, the fleet is rather old compared to the global average. It's around 40 years old. And if you look at the global average, the steel industry plants are about 20 years old. So there is a lot of potential for improving the existing capacities, investing in new ones, and also given the growing demand in the continent, but also in the region, there's a lot of potential also for increasing this demand, also because there's local demand. There's potential for local demand to grow. Majority of the output is used for a wide range of manufacturing industries, but construction is also having an important share for the steel demand today in South Africa. Next slide, please. Now, when we started this work, we were trying to understand what would be most suitable for the steel industry of South Africa as technology solutions. And the Technical Advisory Committee, which I mentioned, has actually provided with important advice to the OECD on the types of technologies that could be of use and actually that could be considered in specific projects, just like the examples which you heard in the previous presentation. Also the technology implementation timeline is not looking into, let's say, 2050 or so with these net zero roadmaps, emission studies. It's more looking into the short to medium term. So it's quite implementable timescale we are talking about. And as a result, there were 3 technologies that have been suggested. If we could go to the next slide, please. And one of them was the hydrogen DRI electric arc furnace route. The other 2 was a blast furnace with CCUS, with methanol being a byproduct of that option. And then the third option was focusing only on the electric arc furnaces, which is also quite important. As you know, the steel industry is mainly located in the northeastern part of South Africa, and there are quite a number of electric arc furnaces which can benefit from some improvements. So that was the third option to improve the efficiency of electric arc furnaces. I'll only be focusing on the hydrogen, the iron and steel production. And we've done the usual mass energy balance, the emissions assessment of the integrated such plant and what the cost of that plant could look like in South Africa. Next slide, please. I won't go into the details of this, but basically our assessment is an income statement and a cash flow assessment. And we tested the levelized cost of the steel, the net present value, the internal rate of return, payback period, these type of typical economic criteria, as well as the energy emission intensity And we've tested the results by changing the parameters that are most important for hydrogen, as you know, the capex, the renewable electricity supply cost, the cost of capital assumptions, and so on. So it was quite a detailed assessment, which you will see in a second what it looks like. Next slide, please. Now, a summary compared to the reference plant of the levelized cost of steel. On the left-hand side of this chart, you see the reference plant, which is the blast furnace basic oxygen furnace route, which has a emission intensity of 1.8 tons CO2 per ton of steel. And the hydrogen-based option reduces the emission intensity by more than 90%, but it comes with a cost that is around 40% higher compared to the coal-based reference technology. So it's around $770 per ton of steel under current conditions if we were to invest in such a new plant. Next slide, please. And let's see the cost breakdown of these different options. I also put the CCUS option as an example. But in the case of the vertically integrated project, the hydrogen would represent around a third of the levelized cost of the steel. And that is important to highlight because a cost reduction in the renewable power, in the electrolyzer technology, also the direct reduction plant, or I want to highlight that because that's a focus area which we also have with the World Bank as the OECD, the reduction of the cost of capital, because it's a big capex question. If the reduction could happen in these parameters which I just outlined, there could be a big improvement in the competitiveness of this production route, which I'll show in the next slides. Next slide, please. Now, the underlying message here that the levelized cost of steel is actually highly dependent on the raw material, energy, and the CO2 price. Now, scrap is important, and in the direct reduced iron rod, the plant can run with 100% scrap, also 0% scrap. Here, the assumption based on discussion with the actual industry was 30% scrap rate. And if the price is increasing for various reasons of supply constraints and other things, this has an impact on the hydrogen-based production option, which you see in the second gray bar from the left-hand side. So on the left-hand side, if you can look at that. Obviously, while we're doing the cash flow analysis, we were also taking into account that the price of the supply cost of the hydrogen would be decreasing, but if it stays constant around $4 to $5 per kilogram, that also impacts the competitiveness of the production cost of the hydrogen-based option. And the same argument goes for the renewable price. So the prices were about 4 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour, which were declining to 3 cents in a decade, and so on, and further until 2040. And that also has a huge impact on the production cost. And then finally, the base case assumes a $10 per ton CO2 price. And that price increase actually is important because it's impacting the blast furnace, so the coal-based route, and the competitiveness clauses. But to be frank, the levels, so the sweet spot which we've identified for the hydrogen-based route to compete with the coal option or the coal reference case ranges between $100 to $150 per ton CO2. So a substantially high CO2 price would be needed. And even then, the cost gap is not fully closed. And there will be need for other instruments, which I'll show in the next slides. Next slide, please. But just before that, we've also asked this question about what type of instruments we would need in order to be able to close these cost gaps which we've identified. So we've done a priority assessment of the financial instruments, de-risking instruments, and also economic instruments, which we should be testing for closing the cost gap. So we've consulted the financing community, we've consulted the industry actors, and there were 6 of them that stood with high priority. And you see them from left to right as the dark shaded green area means there's a lot of relevance for that instrument. CapEx subsidies or viability gap funding, green premiums, reduced tax rate, concessional debt rate, concessional debt in the total debt as a share, and also hydrogen price subsidies. Now let's look at the next slide and try to understand what works and what not. Our main conclusion is that a mix of these instruments are needed because none of them actually breach the full competitiveness gap. CapEx instruments are useful but insufficient because there's also a high OpEx cost. And there we need a lot of focus as well. We need to create demand, so green premium comes forward. And finally, and I mentioned the very high CO2 prices, but we need to be very careful there how they are being implemented and designed because it also has a cost on the budgets. And they could come in different mechanisms, whether ETS, carbon tax, or carbon credits. But overall, a combination of these are needed to close the cost gap compared to the coal-based technology, reference technology. Next slide, please. Now, this is the very last one, and I'd like to spend around 5 minutes on this slide because it is the summary of all our recommendations. It comes across 6 types of challenges or 6 types of priority issues where focus is needed from a policy perspective. First of all, developing that important national decarbonization roadmap, steel roadmap, or different types of roadmaps, and we've seen some of those examples in the previous presentation. So the overall policy framework. The steel market conditions are necessarily needing some attention. The production inputs, especially the electricity supply, infrastructure, capacity, and financing. I'll try to spend a bit of time on those that are related to financing. You see one on the very top, which is called encouraging the adoption of the South African Green Finance Taxonomy, which, by the way, the national taxonomy is actually providing excellent clarity to the financial sector on identifying what is green investment. And this is very important from the perspective of basically creating an incentive for banks to know in the steel or other sectors what is a sustainable green investment, and also for investors to be able to address if they are actually investing in a let's say a near zero or a low carbon technology. So it provides a big guidance to the financing community, to the financiers and investors as well. But the adoption of the taxonomy and its implementation, of course, it will be important to accelerate, to strengthen that in order to ensure the technologies which we've focused on here are also invested in the way as they are green by the financiers. I've mentioned a lot the carbon pricing mechanism, but we need to be quite careful there because obviously we need to recognize the dual objective to maintain, let's say, a competitive industry and also to decarbonize the South African economy. So it is important to gradually increase the level of the carbon tax from the levels which we've used here, which is $10 to higher levels. At the same time, reduce the tax-free allowance and also increase the performance of the tax-free allowances. So it comes with a number of other actions that need to happen in parallel. Green premiums is a big discussion in many countries, in many sectors, when it comes to these type of near zero emission or green industrial products. What's important here is to assess the readiness of the let's say off-takers, buyers for these products locally, but also if there is a market, let's say, for such green steel, where it will be used, is that quality needed, and so on. And are the buyers willing to pay for that premium? And what about the international markets also? Will there be international buyers to pay for that premium? So there is that important assessment, consultation needed with different actors to understand the use of these green premiums. On the tax incentives, to basically maximize their impact of the tax incentive, they should be designed in a way that they target emissions reducing investment with very clear eligibility criteria. And also in the context of the steel industry and these technologies we've just discussed, including for hydrogen, compared to the tax incentives that, let's say, apply to the income generated from the investment, it is more effective that the incentives are tied to the expenditures incurring from an investment project. So that's an important nuance and difference, because they create larger relative gains. On the guaranteed products and the cost of capital, there is actually potential to reduce the cost of capital assumption here by 2-3 percentage points, so that's an important improvement. And the different de-risking instruments need to be as part of a risk mitigation package used across the different barriers, the risk across the value chain, to be able to reduce the total project cost, and therefore also helping to reduce the need for direct support from the public finance, which is very limited in any case. So risk instruments are, risk mitigation instruments are critical, and instead of using them in silos, their implementation should be integrated within a bigger package, and should be used in the places where they create the largest impact for mobilizing private capital. Finally, on the CapEx and OpEx issue, which I tried to mention in one of the previous slides, CapEx grants are definitely attractive. So that's important, and we know that from the private sector perspective, they help to reduce the high upfront costs, and also for administrative ease, it's important, but it doesn't help for the cash flow. And therefore, on the OpEx side of this projects, carbon contracts for difference are a typical de-risking solution, which also came out of the previous report which we prepared with the World Bank. And the size of the actual subsidy in such carbon contract for difference would decline over time as the carbon price rises. So that needs to go in hand. And all these instruments need to, first of all, because they are also limited in terms of availability and they have their own cost also, but to create the largest benefit for the first of a kind projects are probably the most important examples. They should be implemented, and as there is let's say private capital start being mobilized, their use can be fade out. There's more to this report, which you can find on our OECD webpage. And of course, if you have any questions, very happy to answer them in the coming minutes. And with the very last slide, I just want to thank, one more slide, please. Thank the excellent cooperation we are having with the World Bank. So far, 2 reports already published, the Scaling Hydrogen Financing for Development together, as well as the de-risking report that came out 1.5 years ago. And this year we are working jointly on a weighted average cost of capital paper in our finance working group, which hopefully will be out this year. And very finally, I'll stop here with that. I think you know our financing toolkit, which also has hydrogen components to it. There's an update coming for that in 2 months. So please also watch for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Degar, for this excellent presentation. And it's fantastic to see how comprehensive the recommendations of the OECD go, from policy frameworks and market conditions to the financing and capacity and infrastructure that is needed to advance this low emission steel in South Africa. Due to time constraints, I would say we will only have time to response to 1 or 2 questions. So first of all, I would like to open the floor to the participants. If someone has a question, you can raise your hand and we can address it now that the speakers are here. And we have some questions here in the chat, so I will read it. South Africa had power supply issues in recent years. Have these been resolved, and does it matter for electrification, green hydrogen, use in industry. So that would be for Degar and I guess also for Herman. And ArcelorMittal has stopped its hydrogen projects in Europe. Are their economics much better in South Africa? So over to Degar and Herman. Thank you.
Sure. Maybe I can make a start with the first question. So for the assessment here, the renewable electricity supply was sort of, the capacity was earmarked to the specific project which we've looked into. So grid electricity was there in the model. So in case in certain hours it's needed, it would be used to supply the electricity needs. But predominantly the assessment was relying on the on-site renewable power that is generated. But it's a very valid question, and this is obviously a bottleneck for various countries. And what we've developed as part of the package of our support to South Africa was an assessment of the transmission grid financing and how private capital can be mobilized. So we looked into 7 types of private capital mobilization models for transmission grids. And one that stood out is the independent transmission projects as a very suitable model for different emerging market and developing economies. And obviously, this needs to go hand in hand with the renewable capacity that's been implemented in hydrogen projects on site, but also grid investments will be needed. So it's anyway part of a, let's say, bigger power sector strategy. This needs to be taken into account. Obviously, renewable power will also be, or with priority, will be needed for all other industries, buildings, and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand how private capital can be actually invested in the grid infrastructure. So that's one thing. On the other question, obviously the Steel Industry Association was an important partner to this project. And if you look at the companies, there are several electric arc furnace companies in South Africa, but the basic oxygen furnace, or this type of steel, is produced by a single company in the country. So there was quite big involvement from the Steel Industry Association, and it's sort of a strategic question that is going beyond, let's say, the company, limits, boundaries on the steel sector itself, and how to maintain that in the best way in South Africa for improving its trade balance, and also because of all the socio-economic let's say, benefits that it brings to South Africa to have the steel sector growing. It's a very important question, why also, and how decarbonization with hydrogen can help. I can maybe answer with that, because we did not do a company by company assessment or how the company performs in South Africa versus Europe, but it has been a very big and important question of how to use hydrogen to decarbonize and maintain and grow the steel industry in the country. Maybe I can answer like that. Thank you, Dolph, for your questions.
Thank you, Degar. My contribution, in very as short as I can answer it, on the power supply crisis, South Africa has had more than 2 years now without any outages on the system. And so there's a very direct, it used to be that generation capacity was the major problem of around 48 gigawatts of generation capacity in the country. The utility factor was very low. So that has been increased because the power plants, mostly coal-fired, are under much better management, but also the ramp-up of renewables has been significant. And the transmission company recently published that they have accepted generation capacity additions in the next 5 years of 23 gigawatts, more than 23 gigawatts, of which more than half is scheduled for the next 3 years. Mostly solar and wind, a little bit of battery storage, and a small portion of gas as a transition fuel. So the generation capacity, really that market has been deregulated, and private capital is funding all of that. On the transmission side, the market unlocking is happening very rapidly. The Minister Ramaggopa that I mentioned earlier has concluded the first pilot project for private capital flowing into the grid transmission network. So as far as the infrastructure constraints and the power crisis is concerned, we're not saying that we won't have any blackouts in the short term, but there's a proven track record now of a good 2-3 years without any blackouts, as well as an enormous increase in the private sector capital flowing into capacity. And then very short answer, if I can, to the steel project from ArcelorMittal. The economics do look a lot better. I'm not at liberty to disclose figures, but the project team who we are speaking with very regularly have confirmed that this is the number 2 capex project in the whole of ArcelorMittal Group. That is Saldanha Green DRI. And the main contributors are, of course, extremely low cost renewables close to the plant, and then the configuration of a large iron ore terminal right next to the plant being situated at a port. So the export potential, even just of DRI pellets or pig iron, even long before the need to roll it into steel. So it looks like one of the most viable, economically viable projects that we've seen on green hydrogen, and especially because then the transport cost sits in the steel and not in the hydrogen or ammonia. So transporting DRI pellets is 2% of the cost of the product to get it from here to Europe, whereas something like ammonia could be as high as 40% of the cost of the product to transport from the south to the north. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other hand up or questions in the chat. So maybe, Dolph, would you like to provide the closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, very much thanks to Herman and to Dea for these excellent presentations. I think it shows that there's a lot going on in South Africa, and the situation is rapidly changing. My takeaway from this session is that the environment for these type of investments is significantly improved compared to a few years ago. And I think that is also a very good message now for this CIF program that is in preparation. And it's improvements on the enabling framework, it's improvements on the grid, it's improvement on the general investment climate in South Africa. So we should really make sure that we work with the latest information as we develop this program, and I hope we can continue this discussion in the coming months. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you, and with that we wrap up the session. Have an excellent start to the year, and we look forward to having you in the next H4D webinars. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.